So thank you so much for giving us your time.
Of
I
course.
know you're a busy person. So can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are, what your beautiful gifts are, and just tell us a little bit about yourself? Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Antonella Aguilera-Ruiz, and I'm based in Northern California, and I'm a naturopathic doctor by training. And so this will be my 13th year in practice, which, getting past that decade mark feels
Yeah.
significant in the life of a practitioner, I think. But really, what brought me to naturopathic medicine was I got really sick actually when I was in college, and I went to the student health center and told them what was going on, and they were like, "So, do you want an antidepressant?" And I was like, "Not so much, or at least not as the first thing."
Right.
And that sort of devolved. And so everywhere, the doctors that I saw, it just felt like they didn't have the right tools to sort of meet what was going on. I think in, hindsight being 2020, I was probably just by definition burnt out. But there wasn't the space to really explore that. And so I had been pre-med. I finished my pre-med requirements, but I was really looking for something more holistic that felt like there was time that sort of that mind body piece felt very connected to. And that's essentially what brought me to naturopathic medicine. With a small detour of thinking that I might become a chef, and nutrition has actually become very important in my practice. And it's, I would say, probably a bit of the secret sauce. I really like the food aspect of things. So I would say I eventually became an ND with 9 months that I was bound to go to the French Culinary Academy, and then sort of literally switched at the very last minute. I was in a hotel room in Portland. I had paid the deposit at both places, and my mom was like, "So have you made a decision yet?" And it was 11th hour the night before on a Sunday that I was like, "Okay, I guess I should go to naturopathic school instead of culinary school."
Oh man, I would that okay. So that sounds amazing. So tell me about, because that means your love for food, there's,
Mm-hmm.
because tell me about that. Tell me about just kind of the 11th hour, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty big and pretty dope to hear, because a lot of times you don't, especially if you were pre-med, right? So when,
Mm-hmm.
I always hear stories, right? I recently interviewed an OBGYN. She was like, I knew I wanted to do that, but at 3 years old, right? So, you
Yeah.
know, you were pre-med. And so for you to have, I'm not saying pre-med people don't have other interests, but for you to say, hey, at the 11th hour, for me, that's music to my ears. So tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about, because you had there, what was your story around food and around being a chef? There's something amazing that I want to hear about that. I know it is. So
Yeah.
tell me a
So
little
I
bit.
was a pretty atypical pre-med student in that
Okay.
I knew I didn't want to major in the sciences. This is going to sound so counterintuitive. I understand biochemistry now, but so I started as a philosophy major, eventually switched to a religious studies major, but did my pre-med. So I've always I think had a very wide curiosity and sort of
Right.
interest in the world. And then when that year that I was really sick, so I started really sick in college, I eventually took a year off. And in that year off, when I was exploring these more holistic ways of healing, diet came up a lot. And so I just got really interested in cooking. And I'd always been I'd always lived by my stomach. My parents joke about it now. I would just dig into ribs. I just loved eating. I just loved food. Um, but I really just started to teach myself, and I noticed what a dramatic change it made in terms of my health. But I now looking back at that time, I think it was more, it's the creativity and the connection and the culture and sort of the expression and the community around food that I was really drawn to. And I think the ability for food to be a vehicle of change and connectivity. And so when the moment came to choose, it didn't feel like culinary school would speak to that. It would speak to the development of skills, but
Right.
it wasn't, I was in the end, I think I love food because So let me illustrate this with a story. So a couple years ago, I was on vacation in Italy. We went to this like little like agrarian hotel out in the countryside in Umbria. And I was able to cook with the woman who ran it. So she's like this brilliant cook. She's a grandma. We did it all in Italian. And I had this moment where I was just so overcome with emotion because I was like, this to me is like what everything I love about food. Like I knew about the region. I could ask her about these lentils I had read about. And she was like, how do you know all this stuff? But I realized like that wasn't going to happen necessarily in like being yelled at as a line cook in culinary school. Like that was like what was going to be my life. And that wasn't the thing that I really loved about food. And so I was like, I think I can always foster that connection to food outside of like formal training, where it's much more difficult to teach oneself to be a doctor. You know, like that part was a little bit harder. So that was the 11th hour decision.
Wow. That is like, I love that story because it's so colorful, right? Because what you talked about was community, right? It's a culture like around food. What does food, when we think about different cultures, right? I used to teach 5th and 6th grade. And so during winter break, right before winter break, instead of like 20 plus years ago, they used to call it Christmas, right? Christmas break, but winter break, right? Now holiday break. I had a lot of students they were from a different walks of life. But what I did was before they went on break, I said, hey, we're going to have a party, but I need you to bring a staple of food from your culture. And the reason that I did that was I needed them to see how similar they were. They just used different spices. And I didn't want them to think that they were so divided. So they might use chicken, but you might put that with chicken. You might have chicken biryani, but you might have arroz pollo. You know, you might have like Spanish, like rice and chicken and rice and peas in a different way. But then in another community, you might use that chicken for fried chicken, and just them to see the similarities and just knowing that, hey, your spices may be different based off where you're coming from. And we talked about that, right? But then there might be things that you don't have in your region or in your culture, but how are we similar? And it's interesting because those students now, I think, man, some of those students are, right? They're like 10 years younger than me, right? So they're in their 30s or they're in their late 20s and they're still friends. They're like still friends. And when they came back, and it's something about food that's really healing, right?
Yeah.
There's something about it. And so that's amazing story. So how does that look like in your practice? What do you really practice? Like, what are your clients? What are the things that you see or your niche? Like, what are the clients or the patients that you work with?
Yeah. So in general, I mostly work with women. I would say probably now more in that like midlife, perimenopausal, menopausal stage, but that brings a lot of other concerns, right? Like I would say weight is right up there, but it might be autoimmune or digestive issues or cardiovascular risk, right? Like knowing like, does my cholesterol matter? My sister, my mom, or my dad also had a heart attack. And so while there's like all the other integrative options, I think I spend a lot of time in terms of food and nutrition. And I would say like not in the way, like I really try to not be restrictive. Like I really want us to be guided by the research, and the research is like very clear that a healthy diet, like say that quote unquote, like it's less strict than we all think it is. Like it's not perfect, but it's a pattern. Right. And very much I think speaks to what you're saying, right? Like a legume can be a dal, it can be red beans and rice, it can be rice and lentils, right? Like it doesn't have to be a specific flavor, but those patterns, if we're able to achieve them over time, that's what actually moves the needle in terms of our health instead of something super strict and perfect for a few weeks. And so I spend a lot of time talking through nutrition and like those big pattern changes. But probably the more specific example is that I developed something called Doctor and the Chef very early on in practice, which is like a cooking class. It's now become experiential because we can do it over Zoom. Like the pandemic actually moved us out of an actual kitchen where I would cook and people would watch to me cooking in my kitchen and participants cooking in their kitchen, which is actually a really nice setup. And so we talk about different aspects of the Mediterranean pattern, and then like do recipes and seasonal recipes and sort of talk through food and all of those things and myths. Like I read on social media that you should never eat legumes. And so we'll talk, whether or not that's true,
Right.
And then prepare a dish. And so it's sort of woven in a lot of aspects as like treatment, but also as like building culinary skills as well. And then just joining around food and people being like, I burnt my Thanksgiving dinner, or we'll share like, what's the worst food you've ever eaten, or like the biggest disaster, right? Like I burned an eggplant the first time I taught cooking. I like briefly worked at Williams Sonoma and there were like too many fires, and that never happened to me. So we get the opportunity to share things like that.
Wow, that is amazing. And so it's almost like what I'm hearing is you're shifting mindset, right? There's a mindset shift, but then you're walking with them around, like going in the kitchen. You're going with people in the kitchen where their body is changing. So if we think about perimenopausal and menopause, like their body is changing, but hey, how do we change a little bit in the kitchen as well? So there's a mindset shift. It sounds like, how do you get to know your body as you go into menopause, right? It's
Yeah.
really powerful of there's these changes, but I'm going to walk with you, and you get to share some of your stories as you're going through these changes, even in the kitchen. I think that sounds amazing. Yeah.
And it's such, I mean, I think historically when we think about like all the stories that have been shared in kitchens for eternity,
Right.
it's sort of like a very special place in that regard. And so, yeah, like we're able to just like come together and cook. And my hope is that we're also like taking some of the stress out of it. Like
Right.
I will say, I think in the wellness space, like there's this ultra focus on food, but it's almost like what you shouldn't eat, or like how food is going to be so disastrous for you. And so it creates this very stressful relationship to like doing it wrong. And so I think flipping the script around celebration and joyfulness and pleasure is just such a different framework to
Right.
enter into the thing
Yeah.
we do at least 3 times a day, if not
Right.
more.
That's amazing, because when I think about, so I just turned 44, and it's interesting because coming into, okay, what's perimenopause? Like, what does that look like for me? And to hear like the joy, like the celebration around food, I know that, it's been like 2017, 2018, I changed my relationship with food. And it's now, and I've gone like plant-based, but not like if I want some meat, I eat some meat. But it's interesting because what you're talking about, I've experienced with food, and I didn't have it before. It's joy, like, oh my gosh, I just made that, or I did the seasonings, or I did that, right? It's an amazing experience. And so I guess my thing for you is kind of when a client comes in and they may be, entering menopause or autoimmune, right? I think there's the way I see it in the mental health sector is it's kind of like there's not enough information around autoimmune until you're in the space, but then because your body might be in so much pain, depending on what you're navigating, a lot of times I see a lot of people going the traditional route.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times, sometimes I see it that the doctors don't necessarily get it right. Like I've had some of my clients be misdiagnosed. So when you first get your clients, what does that look like? What is that? Are you when they come to you, where are they on their journey? Do they already know, hey, they've gone to see their doctor, or are they like, hey, this is what I need right now? Like, where are they usually?
Yeah, it will depend, but there's probably 2 camps. There's like the one camp, I think, women who feel like they're just sort of being dismissed very quickly, right? Like it's not being investigated enough. And so I would say it's like that category of like they need more assessment to rule in or rule out. And so our homework is to say like, unfortunately, I think this is still common. I think the tide is changing, but like when women come in and they're like, I'm depressed, or I feel nervous, or I'm worried, it's very much dismissed as anxiety, or sort of like it's all up here, or aging, rather than someone being like, I'm in pain and I'm not sure if this is normal, or I'm noticing these changes.
Right.
Right. And so I would say there's definitely a category where it's like, okay, let's legitimately listen to everything that's going on, do our due diligence from an assessment point of view to see, like, are we really dealing with, you know, burnout? Are we really dealing with, you know, more functional issues? Like, what
Right.
is this thing? And so I think that would be one category. But definitely that second category, I think, are people who are diagnosed, who have either primary care, they're being followed by a rheumatologist or a specialist of some sort, but they feel like the toolbox that they're exposed to in a conventional setting isn't quite complete enough. So, you know, I'll give you the example of a patient who's who's in midlife, has an autoimmune disease, and just had a heart attack, right? And that isn't an uncommon risk factor for that particular autoimmune disease. But no one has really talked about diet and exercise ad nauseum, even though they're interventions that can prevent another event at like 30%, right? That actually have really good data behind them. And so that can be a role that an ND can really fit in knowing, like, okay, you probably do need to be on all these medications. You're well managed from a conventional framework, but there's these two other big tools that we're missing. And then there's all the other aspects of your health, right? There's, how does menopause mix into this? How does your digestive health, right? Like your mental health, like there's someone else who can keep an eye on all the other moving parts, because we're not just one symptom or one diagnosis, right? We're also humans living all the other aspects of our lives. So those, I think those are probably the most common scenarios.
Wow. So do you work, I know certain insurance companies are going like whole health, right? And they're
Mm-hmm.
really trying to collaborate with all the providers. Do you work a lot of times solo, or do you work with other practitioners to work with that particular client or patient that you have? Like what do you see on a regular basis? Like you talked about that patient that came in. Um, how do you work? How do you know, do people welcome your expertise or, you know?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I have a good friend who just graduated as a nurse practitioner, and we've talked about this, right? Like so many people practice in silos, right? That's part
Yeah.
of the challenge. And so, like, I do really try to be collaborative within sort of the confines of something that really isn't set up for collaboration, to be
Right.
quite honest.
Yeah.
So I will do a lot of letter writing to practitioners to
Okay.
say, like, hey, I'm working with so and so, like, I know this is your care. I'm wondering if, like, maybe we're missing this, or could we run this additional test so we better understand? Or I started her on XYZ. I just want you to know so that we're all on the same page.
Okay.
I don't know how welcome those letters are. I assume on a good day they're probably welcome, or people
Okay.
are busy, and you know, I don't want to demonize the other side because I don't think that's fruitful at all. But right, you know, they're struggling with time and all of that. So I just work in a different model that's outside of insurance. I have lots of time, lots of sort of hand holding that can
Right.
happen. Um, yeah, so I wish the system was more collaborative at the end
Yeah.
of the day. I think it
No.
would serve patients way
Oh,
better.
yes. No, no, no. And the reason I asked that is because when being a mental health therapist and just understanding the lovely research about the gut, right?
Yeah.
And mental health, and that's really the brain and all that. And just kind of, if I thought about, my clients, or I thought about, oh my gosh, if my client had somebody like you, right?
Mhm.
And then how we can navigate just treatment for them, right? How to feel better. What does that look like? And what I think people just to look at is kind of how to build a wellness team, right? Like
Yeah.
how you send letters to their providers. And something I really speak on is kind of how do you interview the different providers to be a part of your team? I know
Mhm.
that, when I was prepping for pregnancy and just my body, like, hey, I want my body, know where my body might be deficient in. I went to like a fertility, like acupuncturist, and she was like, oh, she was like, what are you doing here? And I said, hey, I just want to make sure my body is in a certain space before I try, right? Not, hey, I'm
Mhm.
trying. And she was like, I wish a lot of other people would do that. And I was like, but I'm also coming to you as, are you willing to be on my team? This is what I'm looking
Mhm.
at. This is what, and she was like, wow, but it was interesting that particular person, she was like, during one, I think after one session, she said, I don't know why people are starting to get pregnant. And that for me was, I don't know if I want you on my team from an energetic standpoint.
Mhm.
You're your energy and what I'm trying to desire are totally two different things. And so I
Yeah.
just think it's really important, like you said, like sending letters or just that, yes, you work in a different way that somebody who's on the insurance panels do. But I think the importance of collaboration as much as possible is really important for wellness and for balance and for healing, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people are often surprised that it's really a team-based approach. And, and part of that has to do with licensing, like NDs. I did my training in Portland, Oregon, and NDs in Oregon are trained as primary care physicians. So that's my background. But the licensing and scope in California doesn't really allow for that to happen. Right. So I have a more limited scope of what I can prescribe that sort of takes us out of primary care. So
Okay.
there's also sort of the practicality of it, right? That insurance is going to pay for your yearly physical and an MRI should you need one. And so it's really more that like education and guidance. Like medicine is intimidating. And sometimes you don't feel like you have the time to ask all your questions and
Right.
be like, well, what if I went down this route? What would be the pluses and minuses?
Yes.
Like, okay, let me think through this
Right.
side of that tree, right? And I
Right.
think a space to do that is really helpful. And at least in California, that's how I like to work. I think NDs in other states that can, prescribe and be the person in charge, if you will,
Yeah.
practice slightly differently.
That's amazing. So my question is somebody, somebody is thinking about going down that path, right? What
Mm-hmm.
would be three things that you would give them, like new clients, right? Or somebody thinking and curious about it. What would be two to three nuggets or just tips to help them walk down the path of like, hey, I would love to, start working with you or somebody like you, somebody in the, in the same space. How would you guide them? Is there
Yeah, like in terms of like how to make that decision, or like what would they expect after a first
Oh,
interaction?
that's interesting. Thanks for those two questions. Well, like let's think about the person that may have, read up on the
Mm-hmm.
like just read up on it and they're a little bit scared and intimidated because they've always been taught to go to their primary care, right? Just Western
Yeah.
medicine, this in a way of the traditional setting. And so they're a little bit fearful of it. And say they're listening to this and they're like, oh, it's intriguing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That particular listener, how would we, if they're intrigued by it and it resonates, but because of what they've been taught, they don't know they're a little bit scared of going that way. What would be something, and they want to, but what would be something that you would get them to think about more or just kind of like, I know a lot of times, like for me, I do a consultation, just
Mm-hmm.
something of what would be some, just giving them some tips if they really wanted to go down that route. What would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I would say for the most part, like maybe where this gets difficult is like when we start to think about it like as an all or nothing.
Yeah.
Like I think early on in practice, I think as a practitioner, right, like that sort of developed, and maybe that's just wisdom and years under my belt, but like it often felt like it needed to be all or nothing, like it was Western or it was alternative or integrative. And so I would really encourage people to sort of think through like what is it that they're looking for? Is it
Mm,
right? Do they want that greater toolbox? Do they want more time? Do they want to like know all the options on the table? Do they feel just really lost and they just need someone to be able to explain to them what's going on in layman's terms with patience, without judgment, with empathy, compassion?
right.
Um, or does someone just like literally want something totally out of the conventional sphere, like isn't going to interact with it at all? And they are looking for a certain type of practitioner,
Right.
right? And so I think it's okay to be on the spectrum of those things. I will say, for example, like I am very middle of the road. Like I want people to feel like they have very clear expectations. We know what we're doing. We're not throwing ineffective tests at them, right? And so I think it's just worth sort of knowing what your end goal is,
Right.
and how comfortable you are. And I think transparency is big. I think transparency should be very big in conventional medicine, but I think it should be just as big in the conventional medicine space, right?
Right.
There's a lot of super expensive testing that is done, that has no evidence for the outcomes that people are promising, right? I think that is something that works against us and creates distrust in another way.
Right.
So I would really ask about like transparency and testing, and like, you might be okay with stuff that doesn't have evidence. That isn't a judgment call, but you'd at least want to know, I think, right?
Right.
If you're like, this is still in the development stage
Right.
and we're going to charge you $500 for it, someone might be cool. Like, I love cutting edge and experimentation,
Right.
and maybe I won't like hang my hat on it completely. But I would like expect some level of transparency in those conversations, and then you get to decide what works for you. So I would say not all or nothing, and transparency, I think, are two important things as you sort of like venture into that
Right.
space. So,
Yeah. I like that. And so what would be, so you've been giving nuggets through the whole thing, right? What would be one thing if somebody didn't hear anything that you said, all the wisdom that you shared, what would be one thing that you would want somebody to take away from this? Like they can walk away, it could be one word, it could be one sentence, it could be go back to what you just said, but just one thing around wellness, around if we think about your clients, if we think about the women that you see and they're in that
yeah.
space, well, what would be one thing that you would want them to take away from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably at the end of the day is that this is maybe like a new idea, and so I like need to talk it out loud, but I think there's a good nugget here is that I think I'm more and more thinking it's not so much like the tool, like does someone use a supplement or a medication, but it's the environment of like standing shoulder to shoulder with someone and like really allowing for that conversation in depth so that someone comes to a decision very well informed of what's going on, right? Not all of us have like physiology and anatomy and biochem training, and our health is so intimidating
Right.
and we can feel like we're on the back foot. But I think if we create spaces where we can advocate and ask questions and that's welcomed, and we can like really dig and say like, what's the best choice for me? The dynamic where that happens, I think that's the most important part, right? Like the tool at the end of the day is a values question, but the way we get there and the process we get there, I think that's the medicine that feels fundamentally different than just being told, do this, I'll see you in 6 months, or just do what I say, right? I think we're over that.
Yes.
But what looks different is that very collaborative, like,
Right.
what do I think about this? What is my value? What do I want at the end of the day? And having an environment that allows for that to happen, I think, to me, is the most important piece.
Amazing. I love that. So, where can people find you? Because your wisdom, everything that you share, where can people find you? Where can they find you on the web or?
Yeah, so probably my website's the most consistent thing. I'm not great on the social media. I've learned I'm a geriatric millennial, so I barely spend any time on Instagram.
Right.
Or any of the things, but my website is the most up to date, and then you can get on the email list, and I do send regular emails and up to date. And I'm working on a project with a friend called Research Reflection, so we like go down research rabbit holes, but how that applies practically to people, and so you watch us nerd out on that, which I think is really fun. But all of that is via the website, which I'm sure you'll put the link. It's my full name, which is a mouthful. It's easier to see it written, I think.
Okay. All right. He will. Yes. Well, I thank you so much. I would love to have you on again, and just thank you for your time and your wisdom and your knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.